Boatworks Today is sponsored by Total Boat and Alexial Yacht Coatings, as well as supported by the generosity from the beautiful folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much.
So welcome back to the shop, everybody. Hope you are all doing well. Now, before we dive into this, I just want to say up front, if you can't tell, I kind of feel like crap. We finally came down with a little bug that's been floating around our house since damn near Christmas, but I'm going to try and do my best, so bear with me here. Now, for this week, we have a video submission from Chuck, and what he has, it's a 1983 J29, and, specifically what he's got going on is that he's, I'm just going to let him explain it. I'll be right back.
Good afternoon, Andy. This is Chuck Bowers. I'm aboard Rum Runner, a J29, 1983, hull number 47. This summer I'm getting ready to do a big project in terms of redoing the Nonskid on board the boat, and just wanted to show you an issue that with the cockpit combing, and wanted to get your opinion on it. Okay, here we are with the cockpit combing. As you can see, I've left it dirty so you can see it a little better. I've got this whole maze of fine cracking in the Gelcoat at the transition over the edge of the cockpit. And I'm just trying to figure out, when I go to paint I'm going to paint all the old Gelcoat and also redo all the Nonskid, because as you can see, it is basically pretty much as smooth as glass nowadays. All the original texture Gelcoat is basically gone or been painted over. So my plan is just to sand that down smooth and do the soft sand, with debating between the Alexial or with going with the Total Boat topside paint. So right now that might be more of a budget thing than anything else. But the question is do I need to do any special prep or anything like that to deal with these cockpit, the crazing and the cockpit edges? Thanks a lot, Andy. Hope to hear from you. Bye.
All right, Chuck, thank you so much for that. Let's see what we can put together to help you out here. Now, the situation that Chuck's in is a very, very common repair that a lot of people run into, especially when you're talking about older boats, right? Now, when I say older boats, I'm not meaning that in any kind of a negative way. So, I mean, just as an example, if somebody were to offer me an older boat that's, that is, within the means of repair, or a brand spanking new one, I'm going to take the older boat every single time, just because in general, they were better built. Boats that were built back in the 70s and 80s, it's hard to beat the robustness of their construction. Now, with that said, when we're working through this project, we're going to kind of reverse engineer, right? So we're going to start at the end with what the goal is, and we're going to work our way backwards to kind of break it down step by step. Now, as far as the end goal, we know that he's looking to repaint all of the smooth areas, so that's going to mean having to address all of the crazing that's going on, as well as apply a new non-skid texture. I mean, J29s, they're race boats, and when they get heeled over, you want to make sure that your feet are going to stay where they're supposed to stay. Now, from my perspective, I'm going to be looking at this, in a little bit, maybe a slightly different lens. So whatever approach we end up taking, I want to make sure that it's going to last. I want to make sure that it's going to look good. I mean, there's no point in going through all this work if it's just going to look like, amateur hour when it's all said and done. And then most importantly, I think he alluded to this, it needs to fit within a certain budget. Now, I have no idea what that budget is. So, when I'm going through and talking about different material options, I'm going to offer both sides of the coin just so that everybody can have kind of like an umbrella overview to potentially help them with the decisions that need to be made on their own projects. All right. Now, with all that said, the first thing I want to chase down is, making sure that however we approach this repair, that the work is going to last. Otherwise, it's going to end up being a huge waste of just time and materials. And kind of the biggest elephant in the room here is going to be addressing all of this crazing. Now, before we kind of figure out how to fix it, I think it would be helpful to first understand why this crazing is happening in the first place. Now, typically this boils down to either one or two things. And, kind of the most obvious, or what most people, seem to think as common sense, is that it just comes down to that the gel coat is just old. It's just tired, it's worn out, and that's why it's cracking. And there is some truth to that, although it typically doesn't result in crazing that's to this extent. What I think is far more likely and honestly far more common is that it goes all the way back to when the boat was first being built. Now, just kind of as a real warm and fuzzy overview here, when you're looking at building a boat in a production type setting, the hull itself, and that could be even the deck, but any of the parts, they're manufactured from the outside in. So, for example, if we're talking about a hull, because I think that's going to be the easiest way to kind of relay this info, when they're starting to lay up this hull, these guys or girls, these people, they're inside of the mold, and the first thing that they will shoot down is a good coat of gel coat, and because when this is all eventually popped out, that first layer, that gel coat, that's going to actually be the exterior of the boat, right? So they're building it from the outside in. So they go ahead and they spray in their gel coat, and then they go in with what are called like chopper guns. Essentially what that is, it's a gun that kind of shreds chop strand matting, mixes it with polyester resin, typically, and then shoots it out. So it's a very fast way to get, at least an initial glass layer built up along the hull. Now, what can typically happen, and this is just the nature of manufacturing, right? They're trying to, they want to get the best product they can, but they also want to try and maximize or minimize their expenses. So what tends to happen is that when they're dialing in the ratios of the resin to glass for these chopper guns, at least initially, they tend to be a little bit resin starved. So that first layer of glass that goes down tends to be a little bit dry. And unless that gel coat, the first layer that was put down, unless that has a good solid substrate to bond onto, that kind of leaves the gel coat floating a little bit, and it makes it very, very brittle. And when you couple that with what we talked about initially with, the aging, shrinking, that kind of thing, that's more oftentimes than not what results in this kind of a scenario. And one of the things for me that I picked up on his video that was a telltale was kind of a glass pattern printing through the gel coat that looks like this. Now, when you're looking at the surface of this gel coat and you start to see these definitive patterns, what that is the pattern of the chop strand, fiberglass beneath the gel coat printing through. And what I suspect Chuck's going to run into is when he starts sanding this down, he's going to start to expose some white strands of fiberglass, essentially unsaturated chop strand matting. So knowing that the end goal here is for Chuck to be able to paint at least these smooth areas and not have all that crazing print back through his paint, what's going to be the best way to address this? And kind of the short story is that we need to make sure that we're stabilizing that surface. One opinion might be that, okay, well, if it is an actual, initial dry layer of fiberglass that's just beneath that gel coat, just sand that off and you should be good to go. And that may or may not work. Personally, I don't know that it's worth the risk of taking that chance, going through the finishing process and, with the time and the cost of the materials, without having your T's crossed and your I's dotted to make sure that it is not going to come back and haunt you. Otherwise, it's going to end up being just a full redo, and that sucks. So now the best way to stabilize the surface, and this is kind of the approach that I've always taken, and so far, after 25 years, whatever, it's got a 100% success rate. So, I like those odds. But the best way to kind of stabilize the surface is to go through and do your initial sanding to remove the gel coat, as well as remove that initial dry layer of fiberglass, right? Get it back down to bare bones. And then you're going to want to go over top of that with a fresh layer of either 1 or 2 layers of chop strand matting, just so that you have a brand new clean canvas or stable canvas to start building off of. Now, as far as the materials to use specifically, what my approach has always been, providing temperatures are going to be working in your favor, meaning that you're going to be 65 or 60-ish degrees Fahrenheit or warmer, is to use some laminating polyester resin and 1.5 ounce chop strand matting. Now, 2 layers would be ideal, but if you kind of follow the curing techniques here, I think you might be able to get away with even just doing a single layer of chop strand. But after the new glass is laid up, then you're going to go over top of that with some gel coat that contains wax. Now, this is going to do a couple of things. For one, because that gel coat contains wax, it's going to completely seal off the fiberglass and the polyester resin so that all that can fully cure. Now, if you don't do that step, when it comes time to actually sand it, you're going to be gumming up your paper like every 5 seconds. So you want to make sure that the glass and the resin is fully cured so that it sands nice. And also, because the gel coat itself, it's a thicker viscosity than if you were to just use some like a wax additive and mix that into the same polyester resin that you use for wetting out the fiberglass. You can certainly do this, but that resin that you use for the fiberglass, it's a thinner viscosity. And the advantage of using the gel coat is that when you're rolling it, brushing it, however you want to apply it, it's going to fill in the texture of that chop strand. So it's going to give you kind of a little bit of a sanding buffer, right? So after everything is all said and done, the gel coat's laid up and it's cured, and you're actually going back over and sanding, you're sanding mostly gel coat. You're knocking that down and you're not really removing much glass. So kind of the long and short of it is that when it's all said and done, you're going to get a smooth surface faster because of that approach. Whereas if you were to use a light, kind of like a thinner viscosity material, now that you're going to end up having to actually sand off a lot of the texture of the glass, you're going to be removing the material that's stabilizing your surface, and that's kind of exactly opposite of what you want to do here. So now, when you get to the point where all the new glass is down, so the surface is stable, you've gone over with the gel coat, you sanded it all smooth. Now it's going to be a matter of switching gears and moving on to like the fairing and the priming, and then finishing off with the painting. Now, when we're talking about fairing materials, not all fairing material is created equal. Just kind of taking a little bit of a step back here. When you're talking about, say, finishing a surface with gel coat, now the thickness of gel coat is a lot more than that of paint. So I forget what it comes down to in millimeters, but let's just say gel coat on average, it looks to be around between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch thick, whereas paint itself is literally paper thin. So now when you're talking about the different types of fairing materials, really the two big ones out there are going to be either a polyester based or an epoxy based. Epoxy shrinks a lot less than polyester resin. And where that comes into play is after you go through, you do your fairing and you do your priming and your paint, it can look absolutely amazing. But if you come back, say like 2-3 weeks later, after all of that material has had more chance to cure and specifically shrink, now what looked like an absolute glass mirror may now start to have some rippling in it. And that's just not ideal. So in this kind of situation, when you're talking about doing your fairing, when you know that you're going to be finishing with paint, an epoxy-based fairing material, something along the lines of like Total Fair, is absolutely ideal. It is the perfect substrate for your primer when you know that you're going to be painting. So now when we're talking about moving into the finishing steps here, this is the stage that can greatly affect the budget, or kind of what your overall expenses are going to look like. And really your three main options are going to be some type of a paint, either a 1 or a 2-part paint, or gel coat. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not even going to include gel coat for a couple of reasons. The main one being, unless you're just doing a small little area, gel coat over something of any size, it needs to be sprayed. And it doesn't spray out like paint. I mean, so after you're done with your spraying, now you've got a ton of wet sanding and buffing to do. And all of that extra work, there really is no benefit to that over top, over paint. So for this, I'm not even going to talk about gel coat at all. We're going to focus on the paint, and specifically 1 versus 2-part material. Now, in either situation, whether you're going with a 1-part like wet edge or you're going with a 2-part like Alexial or All Grip, either situation, I think you can be very happy with the end results, because they can both look extremely good, as long as you have an understanding of what those differences are between a 1 and a 2-part material. Now, anytime you're talking about using a catalyzed material, specifically a 2-part paint, because it's catalyzed, it uses a hardener, it's going to have a harder film finish. It's going to have better chemical resistance, to like oils, fuels, kerosene, diesel, gasoline, whatever it may happen to be. That's just the nature of a catalyzed material. And it's going to cure faster. because it's a chemical reaction, as opposed to like a one-part material that relies on like evaporation and like essentially air curing. Now, in either situation, glass-wise, between a 1 or a 2, glass-wise, I think they're very comparable. I mean, a very discerning eye is going to be able to pick up the difference between a 1 and a 2-part paint, but most people, they're not going to notice the difference. So the glass level is going to be great, and the application is still going to be great. So at that point, it comes down to, is the cost worth it? And that's kind of a big one. A 2-part material typically is 3 to 4 times more expensive than a 1-part material. So what does that mean when you break it down? Well, if a person were to go with a 1-part paint, for the same cost, they would be able to repaint or recoat their surface as needed 3, maybe 4 times for the same cost of using a 2-part material and painting it once. Now, that said, I mean, because it is a harder finish, there is a very good chance that you may only have to paint it once and then not come back to look at it again for another 10 plus years. That's the give and take. So I guess the point that I want to kind of drive home here is that, is the cost of a 2-part material actually worth it? And unfortunately, I can't just blankly say yes or no, because that's going to vary from project to project and specifically from budget to budget. But what I can tell you is that as long as you're going into this with the understanding of what the differences and the compromises are between a 1 and a 2-part material, as long as you have your hands wrapped around that, you will be very, very happy with either material that you end to go with. Again, just make sure that you understand what the differences are and kind of how you intend to use the boat. It might not be a far reach to say that if it's a boat that's going to get a lot of use, a lot of wear and tear, a 2-part material might make more sense. But on the other hand, if it's one of those things like on a fishing boat where it's going to get beat up, it might make more sense to save the money and just every spring just kind of do a quick coat over it and make it look like new again. And again, those are the pros and cons that you're going to need to weigh out for your own project. Now, switching gears and taking this back over to the Nonskid, because Chuck is, like you mentioned, he is looking to redo the Nonskid as well. Similar properties carry over, whether you're using a 1 or 2-part on the smooth areas or you're using them on your gel coat. Similar properties that we already talked about up to this point, they translate over 100%. Now, there is a difference when you're talking about Nonskid on what materials I would highly recommend and which materials I would, depending on how you approach it, you try and steer you away from. So, for example, if you were going to be using a 2-part material, I would 100% suggest that you go with a product like soft sand for your actual texture or the grit. I've used this on several projects, and even 10 years later, customers are still very happy with the end result. Nothing has worn thin. It still looks fantastic. Now, again, we're using the soft sand with a catalyzed paint. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind here. Now, when we're talking about using a 1-part paint for doing your Nonskid, I can't say that using a 1-part paint with the soft sand is going to give you the results that you're looking for. And it really comes down to the nature of how a 1-part material cures, or specifically how it evaporates, right? Now, the texture of soft sand, it's a larger particle than, say, like if you were to get a 1-part non-skid paint, something like Total Tread. The grit that's pre-mixed into that paint is thin, or it is small. And when you're talking about rolling out 1-part material, the name of the game is thin coats, very thin coats. You'll have start to finish, you'll hit the goal line faster doing several thin coats of this non-skid paint than you would if you were to do a single heavier coat of that paint, just because it takes forever. When it's thick, the solvents can't evaporate, they can't flash off. And until those solvents disappear or evaporate out, the paint itself can't start doing what it needs to do, which is, kind of developing its hardness, right? So, for example, going back to something like Total Tread, what I would suggest is doing several thin coats, one coat each day, maybe even 2 coats per day. I'd have to look up their TDS to see what the recoat windows are for that material. But when you're going through this, I would anticipate doing 3 coats minimum, and possibly 4. Now, the way that this is probably going to work out is, so you've done your priming, you're rolling out your first layer of Total Tread. That first coat, the grit texture is going to be a little sporadic. It's going to look a little thin, so it's not going to give you a whole lot of traction. Now, come back, you do the second coat. Now, all of a sudden, the grit pattern is going to be much more uniform and consistent, and you're going to have a more aggressive surface. After 3 coats, the grit texture and the pattern should look very uniform, and you should have good solid traction. Now, if you keep adding additional coats, the grit or the grip on there is going to become more and more pronounced. There is a certain point of diminishing returns where, if you get I wouldn't suggest going out and laying up like 8, 9, 10 layers of Nonskid, because now your paint film thickness is going to be so thick, now that could come back and cause, other problems down the road. But when you're talking about doing a Nonskid with 1 part material, multiple thin coats is the way to go. And when it's all said and done, it will look absolutely fantastic. Now, if you'd like to see how the application process looks for doing Nonskid using a 2-part paint and the soft sand, I'll include a link to that video right up in here. The process that I've worked out over the years, it gives you an absolute flawless finish. And as long as you're able to stay on it or stay with it 4 consecutive days, start to finish, there is no sanding between any of the steps, which is always a welcome bonus, especially when you're at the tail end of a project when 90% of all the work you've done up to this point has been nothing but sanding. But with that said, Chuck, I hope that this helps you out with your project. And as always, if you have any further questions, we had already kind of talked about this a little bit. But if you'd like to get some more one-on-one direction with the project, kind of breaking down each particular step, you can always track me down over on Patreon. And then same applies to everybody here. If you have upcoming projects that you would like to have some one-on-one guidance with on how to select the materials, how to do the individual steps, so on and so forth, the best place to do all that is to hit me up over on Patreon, and I'll include a link for that down below in the description. And on that note, I am going to wrap this one up, go back down to the house, and take some drugs. So, as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thank you in advance, I really appreciate it. I'm trying not to sneeze. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave those down below. I will do my best to follow up with you, and as always, I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for watching, have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you in the next video.
This has been a BoatworksToday production.